Hey, this is Jesse from Yonder Lies. I'm actually recording this from Noble Hotel in Lander, Wyoming, so if the audio sounds a bit off, it's because I'm in this echoey room on my MacBook. But during the first half of the season, we've had some incredible interviews with a wide range of folks, much of which never makes it into our episodes. Because we don't want this content to stay hidden in our Google Drive, we're going to start periodically releasing interviews in full for those who want to dive deeper into some of the conversations we offered in previous episodes. The first here will be our interview with Justin Farrell, author of the new book from Princeton Press, Billionaire Wilderness, The Ultrawealthy, and the Remaking of the American West. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
I'm Justin Farrell, author of Billionaire Wilderness and sociology professor at Yale University in our School of the Environment.
Okay, so simple, whatever. What is the difference between income and wages or salary, and why does that matter in this story?
So salary and wages are usually earned from a specific job, and that's income for sure. But income can also include other sources. For the relative to this book, financial investments are a huge part of that, and so those don't necessarily come from your salary per se. And the more money you make, the more money you make. It's called cumulative advantage. And so if you do have a high salary, you can put that money to work and increase your income. So that's kind of how they're different. And relative to the community, there are a lot of jobs available in Teton County. It's not difficult to find a job in Jackson or in the surrounding area. And what's difficult is to find a salary that would allow you to live somewhere nearby. And the reason for that is because the total income of the ultra wealthy, which is largely within that community from financial investments, is just so much higher. For example, in the book, I talk about how 8 out of every $10 made in Teton County comes from financial investments, which is an incredible amount of money, 3.4 billion, I believe, off the top of my head. Whereas that was just not the case if you look back to 1970s, 1980s, when that number began to climb.
Gotcha. Is there any way to, so say, eight out of every $10 is coming from financial investments. Is there any way for the county or city to even capture that money? Or is that just going into people's pockets?
I'm not an economist, but the most obvious way to do that would be taxation. And so, it's well known that Wyoming doesn't have a corporate or individual income tax. That's why they sit atop Bloomberg Wealth Managers' wealth-friendliest states. And so right now, the state itself is just not requiring much, if anything at all, from the ultra-wealthy. And so that would be the most obvious, first step would be to tax that income that they're making as residents of Wyoming, even though some of them don't live there for the full amount of time that they should. But Wyoming is also very lax on the stringency of those requirements or how they're enforced.
Gotcha. What does qualify someone as being ultra wealthy? Is there a wealth cutoff or how in the book or in your mind is that term defined? Is it a technical term or is it just sort of a broad term?
There's no scholarly agreed upon definition of ultra wealthy or even rich, a more general term that I try as hard as I can to avoid in the book. Folks who study high net worth individuals like me, I'm not a high net worth individual, I study them, but they tend to fall somewhere between 8 million and 30 million in assets. And so there was a Harvard study back in the day that was, about 8 million. And then there's an organization named WealthX that studies the ultra wealthy as well, a non-scholarly organization. they're consultants for different ultra wealthy firms and people. And they put it at about 30 million. Mine is, I started pretty low, about 15 million. So in between the Harvard study and the Wealth X definition. So 15 million for me, was a good indicator that your assets, both statistically relative to the U.S. population, but also just in real terms, that you had enough money to live in Teton County, but you also had so much more money than the average American. And 15 million, I would say, was very low for the folks that I interviewed. And I write a lot about this in an appendix about how I came up with these categories and how I measure them. And many people that I interviewed were far above that. And so while there's a definition, it's not in the literature, it's not this strict definition that we might find with something else that we study. And so it really just depends on who is doing the study and what they view as ultra wealthy, as ultra high net worth, or as rich, or whatever you want to call it.
Cool. So in the broadest sense, it seems like there are a handful of variables that have led to Teton County being, in some ways, the wealthiest county in the United States. What are those variables in sort of a broad sense, in your mind, before we dive into sort of like who are the wealthy and what motivates them sort of conversation? Just how did we get here to a point where Teton County is this bizarre creature in a financial sense in the American West and in the U.S. and in the world for that matter?
The most important condition in my mind is that it's a tax haven. And so we tend to think of tax havens as far away on offshore islands. But, as I show in the book, some are perched atop these pristine mountains of the West. And we see that in the data, and that, billions of untaxed dollars have flooded into rural communities across the West, especially places like Teton County. And the result of the wealth was not this broad-based economic growth or rising wages or rising salaries. And so it's not work in a typical sense. And so, until the 1980s, Teton County really mirrored the rest of the U.S. relative to especially financial investment income. And so if you look at the data, that to me is hard to deny as the main reason why. And you can save so much money every year just by moving to Teton County. But the other thing, there are a few other factors. And for people who have been to Teton County, they know this, and that it's a beautiful area and it has unmatched natural amenities. And, the Tetons, the national parks, other protected land, the national forests, the trails, the clean air, the sunshine for, part of the year. I think that too is a draw. And when you combine that with how lucrative it is financially, it's kind of like a perfect storm. And then there are some other factors like, the airport, that you can fly in and out and on a fairly large jet. The airport was extended in 1959, and it's still, the runway was extended in 1959, and it's still relatively small. There have been some failed attempts to extend it in the 70s, but jets, can still make it work. You can take a direct flight, because I've done it many of the times from Newark, or from New York City right into Jackson. And that, I think, is underestimated in terms of making this community livable for folks who need to come in and out. And if they don't have a private jet, they can still fly commercial.
Yep. I took that flight last week.
There you go.
Yeah, I ran out of LaGuardia.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, cool. So there's this sort of elite class of folks here now. They come from, seems like all over the U.S. Is that true?
Yeah, a large majority come from the East Coast, and that's, I think, again, because of the impact of the finance industry and the growth of that industry over the last few decades within the U.S. economy. Has, that industry's created more millionaires and billionaires than any other. But there is also a sizable pocket in California and then in Texas. And in Texas, it likely has to do with the oil and gas industry there. So, a lot of those, that correlates with population density in the U.S. in general, but I think some of the industries where people have catapulted themselves to this stratospheric level of income, you can look at those hotspots and see where people are coming from as well.
Cool. And so for those folks, there is this sort of concept that you talk about in the book, conservationism. And I think the connection between actually preserving one's money through conservation, or the connection between wealth preservation and conservation, I think for a lot of folks is pretty hazy. Could you just explain how one could both be contributing to what seem like conservation efforts while benefiting enormously from or for their own financial sort of future?
Yeah, primary way is through conservation easements, and that's pretty straightforward. You receive, it usually comes to you as a charitable deduction to your adjusted gross income, usually up to 15 years, or a cash payment based on the appraised value of your land. In exchange for agreeing to put your land under easement, which is a form of conservation. And so that's the primary way. And, obviously not all easements are created equal, and conservation easements are, in my view, a really important tool for global conservation, but they do work differently in Teton County, not just because 97% of the land is already under federal protection, but just how much money this land is worth, and then as a consequence, how much it can benefit you. And in the book, I have some interesting, quotes from financial planners and folks who work on financial strategy, and just talk about how effective this strategy can be for preserving your wealth. And I have a couple quotes, about people who make a killing on the stock market. Now they're trying to offset that income with a huge tax deduction. And so it's very straightforward. And it's, I think for people who are in that industry and in conservation, it's really not that surprising. And some may say, well, you're killing two birds with one stone. And that's true. But I think we tend to focus on the conservation aspect and view it as this altruistic behavior when it's more complicated than that.
Gotcha. Is there a connection particularly between land value and conservation easements too? I feel like that's the connection that I hear most people making, is just okay, I bought this gigantic chunk of land. It's an enormous home that I'm building, and I'm going to put all the land that I can see from my home into an easement to guarantee that it's not going to be developed. Is that also a connection beyond just the tax benefits?
Yeah, and that value has So putting it aside, are you saying that there are benefits other than tax or charitable deductions? Or
yeah, that's what I'm asking. So just in pure in terms of aesthetics and property value.
Well, I guess it would depend on how that land, the regulations around that land relative to who gets to go on it. And is this land now private and you're the only one who gets to enjoy it? So I could see a benefit there. But that would probably be getting ahead of my skis in terms of what's common and what's not. Who has allowed the public to come through their land or come through their easement, and who hasn't. And so I can't really speak to that because I don't know the numbers on that, I didn't dig that deeply into conservation easements, aside from just how effective of a financial strategy it is for people who have killed it on the stock market and who are looking for that huge tax deduction. And so that's kind of, I leave it at that. And as you'll maybe notice in that chapter, I tread pretty lightly there. I know that this is a huge benefit for people, but I also kind of want to just, as I say in the beginning of the chapter, these are very broad trends here relative to easements, and like it's something we just don't think about enough, and we don't think about the ways that it can economically benefit people into them, in addition to them being this environmental savior. And so I wanted to point out the other side of it in general terms. But yeah, I'm not sure how people have structured their easements across the board and whether that could benefit the public or not. But it is private land. And so one option, maybe a better option, would be to donate it to the park or donate it to the Forest Service, and then it could be managed in that way. And you really would be giving it to the public trust. But, I don't see people doing that.
What do you mean by conservationism?
Yeah, so that's another way I try to package in the book why nature is especially meaningful to the ultra-wealthy, and then how they put it to use to solve some of these dilemmas they face about how they should enjoy their money and how they can connect with nature. And so there are a few different components to that. One is that nature for them is very medicinal and very therapeutic, perhaps more so than people from other walks of life or other social classes, and that they view themselves as needing entry into nature more than anyone else because they do need to recharge their batteries. They have been running this rat race, whether it's on Wall Street or some other industry that demands a lot of time, energy, and can exhaust you, that nature provides this way, especially in the Tetons, which is, beautiful nature at its best in their view, that it can recharge your batteries and you can become whole. And some of them would even use spiritual language that it, restores their soul. And these are common themes within American environmentalism and romanticism and transcendentalism and these different movements. But what was really interesting to me was how much they viewed that they needed it. And then two was like that they viewed it as another highbrow taste. And so the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is one of the last large intact ecosystems, and it really is some of the best ecologically that the United States has to offer, if you want to look at it that way. And so like, an upscale art or upscale fine wine, the Tetons and in that area and the wildlife therein is the pinnacle. It's the best of the best. And so it mirrored those other high status tastes that you would find in other, studies of the rich and other studies of cultural capital. And so if you do have a place out in that area, you have, one of the best places, that you can find, and the most prestigious places when you're back in Greenwich, Connecticut at a cocktail party talking about what you did last weekend, or where you go for the summer, or maybe where you're moving full time, that you're moving to the place that has and offers the best. And so that's kind of how I describe connoisseur conservation. But I think another interesting aspect of it was that nature also provides this moral loophole, whereas if you're spending your money on these things, these medicinal and therapeutic experiences, or this 10,000 square foot home that you have, that indulgent consumption is morally permissible if it is nature oriented. So if you do build this $15 million home in this ecosystem, that's okay because it's more okay, because it is allowing you to recharge your batteries, to become whole, to connect with nature, and then by extension, likely to get involved in conservation. And so connoisseur conservation also involves consumption, and consumption, massive amounts of consumption, whether that's electricity to heat your floors in your homes during the winter, maybe when you're not even there, or your driveway. But it's all, again, more morally permissible because it is nature oriented.
Gotcha. This isn't on the sheet I sent you, but I'm just curious. Did you see any difference or disparity with this sort of connection to nature between folks that on different sides of the political spectrum? I know that like the ultra wealthy class here in Jackson is actually kind of like politically across the board. I could be wrong about that, but you've got people who call themselves Republicans, people who call themselves Democrats, people who are independent, all of whom are super wealthy and hang out together. Were there any disparities there in terms of this connoisseur conservationism, or the way that maybe folks related to nature, talked about nature, had a spiritual connection to nature?
No, I didn't find many differences across the political spectrum relative to connoisseur conservation or the way that they engage with nature. The one thing that I did find that I don't write a lot about in the book because I don't think it emerged as a strong enough pattern in terms of differences, like to write about, but talk about climate change and talk about thinking beyond saving the moose in Wilson or saving the moose, when you're driving to the resort and to the village. And so these narrow issues that everyone's kind of focused on in the community, some were able to think outside of that and think about the way climate change is impacting those charismatic animals that you like to see. And so, but overall, this wasn't a story about, in terms of how the stereotypes go, the greedy conservative people holding on to their wealth. I talked with conservatives, I talked with independents, I talked with Democrats, and many of the patterns in the book reflect that. I think some of the discussions in the chapter on guilt, about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and some of the trickle-down economic theory that I found present, that is, just present in American culture and in our economic system. I think that may have been stronger for some of the folks who tend to identify as more conservative, but that's expected, and that's, to me, that wasn't at all that interesting. And so, no, what was maybe more interesting was the way that these findings transcend some of the political divisions that at present seem to define everything about our country and all the discussions we're having.
Yeah, that's super interesting. That it's more of a class divide, a cultural divide, than it is a political divide.
Yeah, and I think
go ahead.
The interesting thing for me too, along these lines, is that it conforms to the main finding of there is no social class, here, that we're all just in love with Wyoming. We're all connecting with nature. Just like, political ideology might fade away when you're out on a hike, so do social class differences in the community. And that was one of my main findings, was the way that everyone with wealth wants to be normal, wants to see the community as normal, wants to see a community that is undivided, that isn't wrapped up in all of the political argumentation and the polarized discourse. That, we're all here beneath, in the shadow of the Tetons, to just enjoy nature, to get outside and to celebrate, what this place has to offer. And when you start to dig into, differences between your conservative friend or your liberal friend, that's a faux pas, just like it is to talk about the reality of what wealth has done to this community, and in a way that is unacknowledged, at least from my vantage point.
Yeah, sweet. That's like a perfect segue into there are very clear ways that this influx of wealth is affecting the community structure, and is like particular. Well, maybe not, like relatively particular to Jackson. And, you've got this chapter on gilded green philanthropy, and how patterns of giving are actually a little bizarre. Some things are funded more than others. The environment arts organizations are heavily funded. There's not much funding for social programs. Could you just talk about sort of the differences in giving, the patterns in giving in Jackson, and sort of the disparities between different organizations in town?
Yeah. Before jumping into the disparities in giving, I think it's really important that we understand why there is a need or a market for philanthropy in the first place. And ironically, and I think somewhat counterintuitively, the influx of this great wealth actually created a greater need for charitable giving. And so there's this hole that needs to be filled that everyone acknowledges when they're talking about philanthropy. But it's based on this paradox, and it starts with a question about, can wealth solve the very problems that wealth itself creates? And so I think we need to first step back before looking at, who gets what money. Why is there a need for philanthropy? And why are organizations that I show that are underfunded, why aren't they funded from other sources that wouldn't depend on the whims of the ultra wealthy? So to get to your question about, who receives most money and where dollars. Sorry, go ahead.
Could you quickly unpack that real quick? I mean, in my head, I can sort of think about how to tell that story,
Sure.
but could you just say a little more about that?
So, in other words, there's this perception that. Start over again. So, there's a market for philanthropy in Teton County, and I begin this chapter asking, well, why is there a market for that? Why is there a great need for charitable giving that is then ostensibly filled by the ultra wealthy, and praise is heaped on the community as it being, as I have all these quotes, it's the most philanthropic community in the country by some people's estimations locally. You have a huge number of nonprofit organizations relative to the number of people who live in Teton County. And so the concept and the need for idea about philanthropy is just pervasive. And among the ultra wealthy, I found that there is a widespread perception that their philanthropy, can make up for some of the problems that they see. In other words, there's a perception that plutocracy can indeed work and work well, and that plutocracy, which essentially means a society run and guided by a small number of wealthy people, that there's a sense of the concentration of wealth among a very few actually has potential to transform a community for the better, and that as long as the wealthy are being philanthropic and are loosening their grip on some of their money, that they can give it, and that it can help the charitable organizations that are laboring at the ground level, that they can get their work done, and that some of these problems can be solved. And so that's kind of where I start with this chapter, this perception, this widespread perception that it is a very philanthropic community. And yet I also point out that wealth has caused a lot of the problems that are right now being attempted to are filled by the wealthy themselves. And so, but as I show, perception and reality can differ. And this puzzle about whether the perceived villains, which would be the ultra wealthy, are the actual heroes, to me was an open empirical question, and was something that you really can only answer with data, and with data on assets of these NGOs and assets of different sectors within the community. And so I asked in this chapter, in the wealthiest community, in the wealthiest country in the world, where exactly is all this money flowing? And secondly, where is all this social influence flowing? Because that is also, as important and sometimes more important than just financial giving is the human capital and the social capital that is provided to some of these organizations. And so is all this wealth that, these folks told me that they were giving, is it to alleviate suffering, to promote greater equity, as is the assumed purpose of philanthropy, or to preserve threatened ecosystems, or to fight climate change and things like that? And so I dug into the data to see where it was, what was the truth, and how to separate, these perceptions from reality on the ground. And really what I found, to put it, succinctly is that a lot of the arts and environmental organizations have the wealth, have the assets, and that has really exploded within the last few decades. I have data in the book starting from 1997 and just showing the growth of assets and comparing organizations like, the Jackson Hole Land Trust or the Community Center for the Arts, the Grand Teton Music Festival, and to see how they've done since 1997 compared to some of the main social services organizations and organizations that are trying to keep up with how ultra wealth has transformed this community, transformed the housing markets, and they've just flatlined for the most part. And I think it's even just since I've written the book, I'm hopeful that that's changed a little bit. I haven't seen the data, but in terms of the long-term trends that we see, the money is not going to, in my view, the organizations who really need it to make this a functioning community and to achieve the type of community that the ultra wealthy think exists there in terms of this small town character. Everybody gets along. We look out for one another. Well, if that were true, these numbers would look a little differently.
Gotcha. So just to summarize that, is it fair to say that the ultra wealthy have moved into this place in a pretty intense way, have brought a ton of money and the desire to give. They've created, say, this is a really simplistic framing of this, but say the ultra wealthy have created 100 problems in this town, but they're only really excited, of which some can be solved through philanthropic giving, but they're only really working to solve maybe 30 of those problems, maybe in the sort of environmental sector, but aren't really providing enough support to solve those problems sort of in the sort of social sectors that they've actually caused here, or that that they've caused here, I guess.
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting analogy that they are contributing to some of the needs, and they're filling some of those needs. And I think relative to environmental issues, that's true. But for me, the other half of my analysis is why. So what is it about these other issues that are not getting the attention that they need? And so in my interviews, I probed on these issues and found that there was a hesitancy to, one, get involved in these issues that could be viewed as political. So some of the environmental issues, they may be, politicized locally, but these are not deeply political issues like climate change that are requiring us to restructure the energy sector to rethink how we consume and these deeper issues that are going to require policy that are going to go to the heart of some of our political institutions. And so they favored non-confrontational environmental work. But also, and perhaps more cynically, there are self-serving reasons that not just because they want to protect their own viewshed or the wildlife that they like to show their friends when their friends visit them, but many of the issues that are viewed as most prestigious and in which the social circles in which they run, that they're rewarded with social prestige by working in the arts sector or working in the environmental sector, and so there was also a social function to it as well, in addition to giving money to causes they care about, but they receive social benefits from certain sectors, but from not others. And so these buzzkill issues, as I call them, which, homelessness in the elementary school or hunger or things like that, they moved here to get away from those issues in some regard, and to see them can cast a shadow on this paradise. And so when they're looking to give their money, or when they're looking to go to, an event where there may be a talk and there may be an ask for a donation, they're opting to go to these prestigious, events that conform with the reason why they moved to the community in the first place. And that has to do with environment. That has to do with these other highbrow tastes, like the the music festival and things like that. And so it's just an easier transition to make than, getting involved in fighting hunger or getting involved in the political process to try to provide better policy for so people don't get evicted, to provide and solve the problem of affordable housing, which are very difficult issues and which involve engagement in the political process, unlike some of the other more environmental and arts related philanthropic opportunities.
Gotcha. Yeah, it seems somewhat derivative of just this like property of that social community of not talking about politics. Like that being here is not really about that. In some
just
way
like it's not about talking about social class or talking about wealth inequality or talking about real environmental issues like climate change and the sources of climate change. Like these issues, when you're on vacation, you don't talk about those things, but many of these people live there all year round. And so that's where I kind of pointed out the discrepancies, between what needs to be talked about and what isn't being talked about, and how that relates to just the general experience on a day-to-day basis in this paradise.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you've already kind of touched on this, but you talk about how a lot of these folks, and I would say like many people in Jackson, myself included, are kind of imbibing in these myths of purity and sort of, myths of the American West, rugged individualism, all this kind of stuff. Could you just talk a little bit about how that manifests in these elite communities? Stories around purity and environmentalism and the West?
So the West has always provided this myth that is deeply meaningful to many Americans, and we're socialized into it through media, through movies, through music. And I saw that at play in this ultra-wealthy population. And part of it had to do with these social stigmas that they face. And that is the reason why, in my view, these myths resonated so strongly with this group of people. And so they're burdened by these greedy social stigmas, this anxiety about their status as an ultra-wealthy person in the 21st century, where they're hearing conflicting messages, whether it's, we elected an ultra-wealthy celebrity president, but on the other hand, you have people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and even more moderate Democrats criticizing wealth and criticizing the billionaire class, and that can lead to feelings of inauthenticity or questioning or being anxious about your role in society. And so the ultra wealthy use these myths, and they use this romantic view of rural people as a vehicle for their own personal transformation. And so they attempt to create these versions of themselves that they view as more authentic, more virtuous, more community-minded. And so this personal transformation is modeled after this popular idea of this working poor person in a rural Western landscape who, they may not have a high status career. They may not have the types of material comforts and luxuries that I have. But you know what? They seem free from the snares of wealth and power. They seem free from the traps and the moral predicaments that I've been placed in my rise up this corporate ladder, the decisions I've had to make, the sacrifices I've maybe had to make at times to my own moral character. And so they view this stereotype, the stereotypical Western working poor person, that they are living this noble life of contentment, of frontier authenticity, that they're part of a community that is deeply cohesive, that has these old-time values. And then they also have this special kinship with nature. They like to go, hiking in the mornings. They like to go ski off these high alpine environments, and they connect with nature in that way. And so that also includes, the ranching culture and the myth of Wyoming and this cowboy who, lives this life on the range. And so it's all kind of blended together into this romantic stereotype. And so what was interesting to me is that the wealthy folks perform this social conversion in all sorts of different ways. And so they signify outwardly that they've made this transition. And so this could include their friendships with working poor people, or maybe lower income and sometimes middle class people, but oftentimes it was this lifty that was barely getting by that they had in mind. It was this barista who maybe working at the coffee shop. They also work in the village or taking lift tickets and things like that. But again, they view them as having this experience that sometimes they wish they would have had, and that they're trying to regain. Another way they perform this social conversion is their relationship with nature, and that manifests itself in all sorts of ways through connoisseur conservation, as I discussed in one chapter, but also this professed environmental concern that you move to this area, you immediately get invited to this elite picnic or this event to raise money for this particular issue, whether it's like wildlife art or whether it's the stream quality behind your house, or to save this charismatic species and this animal and that animal. So they become more environmentally engaged, but they also appropriate frontier art and styles of dress. And so talk about their love of Wrangler jeans and similar jeans like it, sometimes cowboy boots, and just this general love of Western character that they try to live out. And I think by living in these rural and nature-oriented communities, it allows them to literally buy into this idea and this experience of a primordial Western Americana setting that offers salvation from that rat race that they were running. And they're able to move to a setting that is ostensibly simpler, and where these honest rural values prevail, and where they can kind of live the life of this dusty cowboy or a noble native person or a nature-loving van plan bohemian. And those are all kind of lumped into the same category. Yet the irony is that this popular idea of the working poor is mostly off or completely off base than the reality of a working immigrant family, sharing a trailer, rotating through the night and day on beds because they don't have enough space to sleep, and they're working 2 to 3 jobs and barely getting by, and they wish they had more time to go into the park, and they wish they had more time to learn about why it is that their rent goes up and up and up with each month that passes. And so there's all sorts of these stereotypes that are integrated with nature, but also integrated with this culture and this myth that still prevails in the American West.
Damn, thanks. That was an awesome answer. And I think I should just say this too. If you have time over the next month or two, I think what we want to do, just because our episodes are so short, is maybe chat with you again about like situating, like who are the working poor here, like actually. We're gonna do another episode on that, and I wanted this episode to be like situating those two things next to one another. But the more that I think about it, I think we actually just need to cut it into 2 episodes. That it can be situated together.
Yeah, no, it's true. And like the middle, we can talk more about that. But
yeah,
I would actually be interested in that because, we did all these interviews with the working poor, but there was there's obviously, as living there is some variation within that class, and just like there is within the ultra wealthy class. But I think more interestingly, like once you have more than $10 or $15 million, like if you have 15 million versus 30, it's like, what's the difference? But if you're down at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, if you're making 15 or 20,000 a year versus like 40, that's a big difference.
Holy crap.
Qualitatively.
Yeah, for sure.
So like, it's just really interesting to me kind of how we do define the working poor and the middle, quote unquote, middle class.
Yeah. Especially in a place like Jackson, like what is the middle class?
Yeah.
Yeah. Am I? I don't know. Yeah, maybe.
People said it was like doctors and lawyers.
There's just not that many of those folks.
Yeah, or there's just not one. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so short but just pithy questions. In a big picture sense, like what does this inequality do to this community?
The flood of wealth is in communities like this has created, I think, a community veneer, they call it, where it the way it plays out is that it deliberately conceals these outward indicators of socioeconomic and racial and ethnic inequalities, that when you have such a top-heavy class, that it can bestow rewards and for trivial acts of individual charity, of selective environmentalism that, in my view, hide and cover over, almost with like a candy-coated shell, these patterns of structural harm. And I think that the need for philanthropy in this community, again, it can just be a source for alleviating personal guilt. And it really disguises and forecloses the need for economic and political action for addressing concerns locally, but also concerns globally relative to wealth concentration in the United States and globally, but also really significant environmental problems that we're facing at a global level relative to climate change. And so wealth can really distort and create a veneer about what is really going on underneath the surface.
Sick. I mean, not sick, but yeah. Cool.
Dude, it's not sick at all, man.
That's not sick. It's sick. Yeah, it's like ill. The community is sick.
I know, yeah.
In a storytelling sense, do you have any just like attachments to how this story is told, just about wealth in Jackson, what it is, what it is not?
Yeah. Who's your viewership? Like, do you think wealthy folks listen to this?
I don't think many wealthy folks listen to it. I think if they did, we would have more money to make it. But at this point,
right.
I don't. Yeah, it's all over the board, dude. It's like pretty international now. Like mostly younger folks in Jackson and younger folks across the U.S. and some across the world.
Because one reporter from the New York Post the other day was like, I mean, are you optimistic about this? I'm like, no, not at all. Because for me, like where the next step and where I think maybe where you could push your podcast is like, what now? And I really believe that it's just going to continue to get worse unless there are changes to policy. And so for people like need to get involved and almost at a state level. And I don't know how that looks, on the ground. And like, that's where I kind of stop short and then become just the average citizen, because I'm just trying to provide like a diagnosis of the problem. And then, in the epilogue, I do try to offer some solutions relative to, economic solutions about how to demand more from this class of migrants who have come to Wyoming to enjoy its, bounty of natural resources, but also not really giving much back relative to income tax or corporate tax. And so it's like, for me, the real issue has to do with that, but also trying to find ways to constructively draw on these sentiments that kind of are ironic or off-putting about, wearing Wranglers or connecting with the locals and seeing their servants as their friends. How can folks draw constructively on those sentiments and that yearning for transformation that the ultra-wealthy are undertaking and are putting into practice in this community? Like, how can you harness that for good? And I don't think it's like ask them to donate more. I think it's, hey, we need your energy. We need your political capital, your social and human capital to help us make changes that are going to last and that are going to actually restructure how money is flowing into this community and how housing works and local policies. That's all easier said than done, though. Like, that's going to be a monumental task. But so in terms of your podcast, I would just say, like, pushing people to get involved in that way, and rather than just, as you notice in the book, like, I'm very critical of wealth and the wealthy, but I'm not laughing at them or I'm not like, I don't, it's not just pointing fingers and being like, these people are like jackasses or something, or they're so out of touch. I mean, I show that. I just show it basically, and I think that'll, right now, what we need is like organized action rather than just being pissed or, laughing at them and just kind of rolling our eyes. Yeah, this community's changed, because people did the same thing. And I had someone do it in my class last week about the Sagebrush Rebellion. They're like, oh, these people are crazy. Haha. Like, no, it's not actually that funny, because they're reshaping American politics in the West. There are people who have Donald Trump's ear who have staged like armed rebellions in our own country. And you can laugh at them as this like left-leaning liberal sitting in a classroom in Yale, but what good does that do us? In the same way, like, people did the same thing with climate denialists, like, oh, these crazy bloggers, making up shit about climate change and writing their own papers and doing that, this and that. Well, look where we're at, 30 plus years of inaction on climate change, large majority of which is due to the fact that people were spreading lies about climate change and were funded by fossil fuel companies who helped them promote and provide a stage for that. And it's woven into the fabric of an entire party in our country and is basically the policy now. And so similarly, I think we can laugh off wealth, and we can say, like, oh, damn those rich people, but it doesn't mean anything unless we actually like try to figure out a way to make structural changes. And that's going to be very difficult in a state like Wyoming, who is averse to, taxation and averse to passing laws like that. And frankly, is averse to Teton County. But also something that I am constantly perplexed by is the my, family in Cheyenne or other friends in Cheyenne and all of them, and like anyone around Wyoming, for the most part, doesn't view this as Wyoming, and they resent all the East Coast transplants, and they resent the Californians, and resent this and that. Yet still, they won't require anything from them. And so, to me, that is this like inconsistency or paradox that I'm just like befuddled by. But it also, makes perfect sense relative to the history of the state and their libertarian bent. So that's kind of, my soapbox, but that's kind of what I think where I would go with like your podcast is trying to move toward in that direction, and like beyond kind of what I've done here, like where to next. I mean, that's honestly, I'm not sure. It's a really difficult question. And when you had like, I don't know how what's his name, the mayor, is it Mayor Pete?
Yeah, Mayor Pete Muldoon.
Like if he's been able, like what he's been able to get done. I mean, because he ran on this platform. But it's just like, to me, it's almost like a state level thing too.
Yeah. I just wanted to say too that I think like our listenership is younger, and I think that your book is about the billionaires, and there are a lot of things that don't apply to, say, me, Jesse, in Teton County. But there also are a lot of things in this book that apply to me, Jesse, in Teton County too. Like someone who has a really good education and like a ton of social capital and like a ton of intellectual capital. There is this whole untold center of maybe the way that the book situates the sort of social community here of people like me who are like in between things, but who have like degrees from a top 50 school,
Yeah,
and are
that's
just
true.
like like also imbibing in these myths of purity and of like authenticity
Totally.
in the
Me
American
too.
West.
Yeah.
And I think that like I just don't want to let myself off the hook in this too,
Not
because
at all. No, I
yeah,
agree.
and that's what I
Totally.
think is so. The way that I think I want to frame this conversation also just in the podcast that we make is like, and I think this is what is missed in a lot of the reviews of the book, is that almost all of this applies to everyone.
Yes.
And it is like, it was great. I mean, even when I read this, like 3 years ago, I was like, oh, I just learned a lot about myself, and like, I need to figure out like what skills I have to make this community better. And here I am making this damn podcast, and it's like doing what it is, but like this is a skill set that I have to try to like make this place better. And not to say I'm like an angel, but like I actually making this podcast, assessing my skill set and trying to like help the community out has felt really good. Like
Oh, nice.
not in like a now I'm exempt from like all the problems sort of thing or like guilt, but it feels different than when I was here before. Like even this project, like just this podcast itself, having this be a property of my existence in Jackson has felt awesome.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm with you. I mean, I think I had an interview with the Daily Beast. I mean, there's all these outlets I don't read, but like apparently they say to do. And I was like, I'm like, if I had that much money, I would. I don't know what I would do. I hope I would do something different. Also, I'm basically doing what they do, but just at a like lighter scale. It's always just sort of like this ramped up scale. I think I don't have. Well, I don't know. Now I have a platform and stuff like that. But like before, when I was working on this book, like I don't have that much money or that much influence, and so that was always my thing. I'm like, well, they just have more money and influence, and so we demand more from them. But I think you're right. Like I derive all these benefits from going out in nature. Like I have these Western myths that I really like. I'm aware. At least I'm self-aware of them, but like, I think you're right, like completely. And I think that's really good to state, like that it's easy to point fingers. And I always like to use other examples. So like climate change, I can point fingers at climate denialists, but like we drive like this old beat up Volvo that gets like 14 miles a gallon. And like, we could probably rearrange our life to buy like a Nissan Leaf or something, and like, so it's like, there are all these ways that it's basically the same thing. It's just our impact is not as great and our potential for doing something is not as high, but we're still sort of doing the same thing. Like,
I think in particular, this is kind of off script, obviously, but like the concept of connoisseur conservationism, I think, is something that applies enormously to the outdoor recreation industry, particularly these sort of higher class recreations like rock climbing and like mountaineering in particular, the history of mountaineering, but this like particular climbing routes are like a fine whiskey. Like, oh, you've tried that, you've done that. It's a similar conversation to all these others, just sort of like purely social capital, like dumb, I don't know, culinary traditions and things. And I think like that part of the book for me was particularly like, so it was a self-reflective experience. And I think that for folks listening to this podcast, like that I hope resonates. And I think I'm going to sort of like lever into that a little bit just to bring people in. And to like not make it seem like you're just someone pointing fingers at billionaires,
Yeah, because I mean I am, but like also I'm pointing fingers at society. That's ultimately where it's at, and like, so I think it's useful to like convict other people of these same things, but like, not too much because like you're not going to be able to change, but like you could do what you can, right? Some of these people have so much influence. I mean, some of them have like been in some of the highest offices in the land. Like they have more money than, so many. So it's like, or they run media that.
Okay. Yeah. No, you're back. You're good. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know what you're saying.
So I think it's important to point that out for your reader or for your listeners. like, hey, you might not be that much different, but also not to just like be like, all right, we're all the same. Because I don't want to flatten that either or relativize it.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Sense?
Yep, that makes total sense.
Like,
yeah,
it's a fine line. Like, it's like being like, I'm not going to compare him to that, but like, oh, we're all just terrible people. Like, I'm like Trump, you're like, or something like that. I don't know. Like, that's not true, but we all can all do better. Maybe that's the best way to put it.
Yeah.
We all sort of are. We all are susceptible to these myths, and these. That's a longer conversation. I don't think these myths are all bad either. Like, they can distort reality and they can harm certain people, I think, too. But it's also like, yeah, I don't know. It's fucking complicated.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, go.
Are you a socialist? Seems like everyone thinks you're a socialist online.
Well, I think if it's on Facebook, I'm sure everyone's a socialist these days. I guess it depends on the meaning of the word. In the book, I steer clear of ascribing to one identity or another, and I try to be as quote unquote impartial as I can. What I do support is a community that ensures opportunity for all, a community that is environmentally engaged in ways that are actually tackling problems that need to be tackled, and that a community that ensures what I would call human flourishing, and one that does not cover over inequities or pretend that they don't exist, and also one that supports policies that will require more from folks at the very, 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 very top to ensure that there's education, that opportunity. People aren't going hungry in the richest county, in the richest country in the world, and so essentially one that supports the type of community that everyone wish exists, and that the ultra wealthy think exists right now.